Thanks for checking out this video where I continue to paint the minis from Guards of Atlantis 2. I'm taking a quick break from painting the heroes and decided to cover the minions instead. I'm aiming to make this a very simple process to follow along with, and I'll be showing off using several different brands of paint to get similar results. There will also be some extra steps to add a little bit of pop, but as always I'll try to point out some good stopping points along the way if you don't want to follow every single step that I do. This is normally the part where I'd talk about all the mold lines we should clean up on these models, but I can be quick here since the blue minions are really simple on this front. The heavy minion has a few spots here along its left arm that I'd trim or sand, and has a little mold injection point on its heel that you can scrape away if you want, but everything else on the mini, like the mold line on the right arm, is hidden enough to not worry about. The melee minion is also easy. There's a subtle mold line on its sword and running around the body, and my sage advice is to pretend that it isn't even there. The blue ranged minion is also a cakewalk. The line on its leg is hardly noticeable, and the only one I'd maybe bother with is the one on top of each forearm and on the top of the bow, but even then, I really don't think it's worth the effort. The minions are fun, but they aren't the real stars of the show, so unless you really want to go the extra mile, I think the mold lines are for the most part totally ignorable. Moving on to the painting, I prime all the minions white. Any light gray or light blue color is fine, but it'll be a lot easier to work from light down to dark than trying to work from dark to light and build all the way up to these large, whitish, light blue surfaces on all the crystals. Now I'll be using several layers of contrast paint to build up the blue color on the minions. I'm using the extra heavy and ranged minions to test using multiple different brands of contrast paint, but ultimately I found that it makes very little difference. Now normally I love speed paints, but I have the old set, not the version 2 set that they just released, but the original ones, and I'm a little bit worried about the speed paints reactivating, though I'm also taking this chance to just test out how big of a deal it really is. I start with the new Vallejo Xpress Paints, thinning down some Templar white and applying that over the whole minion, but in retrospect I really don't think this step is needed, so for the other two comparisons I skip this pale gray step. Then I pick Mystic Blue instead, and thin it really heavily down with the Xpress Medium, which I do because unthinned it would be really easy to turn this whitish blue colored minion into a completely blue minion. Now spoiler alert, I do decide to go with the Xpress Paints for all the rest of my minions, so while you watch me work through this step on them, I'm just going to briefly explain my thoughts on the color scheme that I'm going for. I think there are two good potential looks to go for with the blue minions, either sort of an ice look or more of a crystal look. I'm making them look pretty icy, but if you want to go for more of a crystal look than an ice look, just make the color more bluish instead of more whitish, using contrast or acrylic paints that are less thinned down than what I'm doing. Either way, I suggest keeping the overall color scheme very blue. You could incorporate some tan or gray rock elements to them and that might look cool, but I want to make the minions read very quickly and easily when looking at them on the board as being the blue minions. Now for my next test model, I switch over to the Army Painter Speedpaints and take a tiny bit of Magic Blue and add it to a mix of Speedpaint Medium and Holy White. It's probably about 5 parts Speedpaint Medium to 1 part paint, just trying to get a really light blue color and using the Holy White to desaturate it a bit. Then I apply this all over the minion, same as before. Then I take the extra heavy minion and I use it to test out contrast paint, taking a lot of contrast medium and adding a little bit of Achelian green, which is actually a fairly blue color. I don't have a ton of speed paints, so maybe there's a color that would have been a better fit here, but this is what I had. In general, with all of these, as they dry, the paint might start to pool a lot towards the bottom of the model. If so, just take an empty brush and pull a little bit of this paint off, but it's totally okay if you're not perfect with this because we'll cover it up later. At this point, the Xpress and Speed Paint results also look functionally identical, but you can kind of tell the contrast paint tints the surface a bit more, and I don't really like the look of that quite as much. The contrast paint also had more issues with pooling at the bottom, but that's probably just because I was using it on the bigger Elite model. And now we're on to the next phase, applying a darker blue contrast paint more exclusively to the shadows. Going back to the Xpress paints, I mixed some Black Lotus into Mystic Blue, still pretty thin, and went around the model putting it in the areas I want to be a bit more shadowy. This is mainly stuff like under the armpits, on the insides of the legs, under the chin, and on the bottom of the belly, and etc. This also doesn't have to make perfect sense in placement. I put a lot of shadows at the bases of random crystal clumps, and the main goal is just to create some depth of color and interest in the shapes on the Mini. In retrospect, I probably wouldn't have thinned this down quite as much, because all that did is mean that I had to go around the model a second time, applying another coat of this to reinforce some of those colors. Onto the Speedpaint minion, I thin down High Lord Blue 4 parts medium to 1 part paint, and do the same thing as on the Xpress Paint minion, trying to pull the paint towards the inner recesses. The two ranged minions are still looking basically identical at this point, but the Speedpaint definitely felt a little easier to pull where I wanted it to be. Also, no activation issues to be seen so far. For the heavy minion, I actually don't have a good contrast paint to darken the blue with, so I tried just mixing some Majos purple into the Ecalian green, but that didn't give me a result that was quite as dark as I would have liked. Again, the solution would be to just own the exact contrast paint that I'd want to use here, but the bottles are like $8 each, which is just a little more than I'd want to pay for them. I know some people get some really awesome results from contrast paints, and maybe I'm just not using the right ones for this instance, but I've just found this to be a bit of a struggle to get a good look with, and in general, a lot of the time when I used contrast paints, I feel like I'm fighting against them instead of working with them. Now, if you like the way the blue looks here, you don't have to do this step, but I really like painting in a high contrast style, so I'm adding some purple into the darkest shadows. I completely forgot to buy a purple Xpress paint, but luckily I bought a red one, so with a bit of color mixing magic, I mix a dark purple by mixing equal parts Mystic Blue, Velvet Red, and Black Lotus together. I also tried out thinning the Xpress paint mix with water, which actually worked really well to get a nice thin consistency. I apply this all over the most recessed areas, trying to keep it even more constrained than the previous dark blue shade. However, it's not a big deal at all if you get some in an unintended spot. The main goal after all is just to provide some variation in color. Basically, just put this on the undersides of the arms, under the armpits, under the chin, and around the bottoms of the legs. For the speed paints, it's the same thing that I just did, except with some Hive Dweller purple thinned down with medium instead. After drying, this ended up a little bit splotchy, so I think in retrospect I would have added even more speed paint medium and applied it a bit more heavily, which might have allowed it to pool more nicely into the recesses like speed paint likes to do. I didn't feel like Majos purple was a dark enough purple, so instead I used Druchii Violet on the heavy minion and applied it to the underside of his raised fist, around the inside of the torso and the bottoms of the feet, and around the lower half of the lowered arm. I also put it under the chin and around the neck, and I was pretty sloppy with this, and I'm still not totally in love with the result, but hopefully some of the highlights will hide this sloppy look. That being said, I don't think it looks bad at all for a tabletop quality minion model. Now that I think the minions are looking pretty cool, I paint the base with Vallejo Model Color Khaki, thinning the paint down with a bit of water to make it flow nice and easily into all the cracks and crevices in the textured base. Which, by the way, these textured bases are really nice. They look good, and it's such a relief to not have to worry about spending time and effort applying basing paste or gluing sand down and making a base look decent on a large number of board game minis. But back to the actual painting, you can see me doing a second coat of khaki here just to get a fairly solid base coat. You don't need this to be super opaque. It's okay if there's a little bit of dark blue showing through still, but I try to get it fairly brown colored. Next, I apply a shade to the base, either using a pre-made one for convenience. For example, here you can see me using Agrax Earthshade, or by mixing any darker brown color you have on hand, such as Pro Acryl Dark Umber, with the khaki color and thinning it down into a wash using a large amount of water. Now, if you want to go really fast, I think this is a good spot to stop. The minions have some nice color to them, and since we used various types of semi-transparent speed paints, Xpress paints, and contrast paints, the white primer still shows through decently well on most of the edges. And at this point, just paint the base rims, either black or the same khaki or brown color that you used on the rest of the base, and I think this is a really good battle-ready minion force. However, I encourage you to continue on with just a few more steps, since they'll really make the minions pop, and I hope they won't feel too difficult. The next step will be dry brushing the minions all over with a very light blue color. I mix up this really light blue and load it into a large cheap makeup brush, wiping off almost all the paint on a paper towel until only a little bit comes off the brush, as you can see me testing here on my thumb. Then I pretty aggressively drag my brush back and forth over the model, and if you don't have a makeup brush for this, just use any old cheap, large, beat up flat brush from an arts and crafts store. This white color isn't really too different from the white that we see showing through from the Speedpaint, so you won't notice much color change and it might feel like you're doing nothing, but it helps to very slightly smooth out some of the color transitions on the model. It fixes where the contrast or Speedpaint's dried a bit splotchy, and it catches some of the ice crystal edges that got darkened down with the blue and makes those edges stand out a little bit more. And now I'm taking a small brush and doing some selective highlights with pure white. As a quick side note, make sure that the white paint that you use isn't too thick or chunky. You can use Pro Curls Bold Titanium White just straight unthinned out of the pot like I do, but I would definitely not recommend using any of Games Workshop's white paints if you can avoid it. I make sure to dab a little bit of paint off of my brush onto a paper towel first, and then I just drag the edge of my brush along the edges of some of the crystals that I think should get the most attention. Usually this is the surfaces around the face, the upper arms and the shoulders, or just any random old crystal edges that I think need a little bit more pop. You do not have to do this on every single edge, that would take millions of years to finish. I only pick and choose a handful of edges and spots per model. While you watch me work through this step, I just want to mention that there's about a week left on the Guards of Atlantis GameFound campaign, which I'm sure most of you know about, but definitely go check that out if you haven't. As always, I'm not affiliated at all, I just really like the game and take any chance I can get to recommend it. Now I'll continue on with some more optional steps. Feel free to incorporate as many of these or as few of these as you'd like, just pick whatever you think is cool or fun and ignore the rest. I make the weapons a different color because I want them to stand out a bit, and just provide a little bit of color interest to the minions, so I shift the color a little bit with another contrast paint. I tried out a few different colors, like the Xpress Color Black Lotus, but I eventually landed on Xpress Velvet Red. I honestly think any color you pick will look good though. And when you do this step, just remember to paint the little sword hilt, as well as the little arrow that the ranged minions are holding. The elite minion isn't holding any weapons, so I skipped that one entirely. And now you can do some extra edge highlights again on the weapon if you'd like, but that's totally optional too. You can make these highlights a whitish color like I do, or you can make it a little bit more vibrant if you want the weapons to stand out a little bit more depending on your preference. Now I'm also choosing to paint the eyes a glowing red color, just to add another bit of interest to the models. If you don't have an airbrush, you can just thin down a red paint really substantially and glaze it around the eyes, just kind of dragging it a few times around the general area of the eyes and cheeks and forehead, or whatever you can make of that on the minion. Alternatively, if you do have an airbrush, it's really easy here to just airbrush a red paint, ink, or red contrast paint over the eyes, and then you get a really nice glow effect around it as well. This is especially helpful on the elite minion, who otherwise doesn't have a lot going on, because you can add some of this cool red glow to its shoulders and hands. Also, if you are using an airbrush for this step, please make sure that you use a respirator and have good ventilation in the room that you're in. I promise that your future self will thank you for it. Then, just to make the actual eyes stand out a lot more, I thin down a white paint and drop that into the eye sockets, and then put a little bit of red paint or ink, thinned down pretty substantially, into the eyes. Optionally then, you can come back with a pure white to highlight the center or front part of the eye, wherever you want the highlight to go. I definitely had to go back a couple times and play around with this a little bit to get a result that I wanted, and then I did it on all the rest of the minions once I had my plan in place. And as one last final step, you can either take some blue contrast paint from before, or some of that light whitish blue paint that we used for dry brushing before, and then thin it down a bit and apply it in a few layers to some random parts of the bases. Hopefully this will help to make it even more obvious that this is a model that belongs to the blue team. You could also just paint the base frame blue too, of course, but I like that the heroes stand out very obviously from everything else with their blue or orange base clips. And after that, I mix a little bit of ivory into the khaki color I used on the base, and I dry brush the bases pretty heavily with this, which seems like it helps to kind of tie in this blue color to the rest of the base. Then I paint the base rim black, and that's it. You might need to do 2 coats of this black to get a fully opaque base rim, but just take your time and enjoy being done with the models. Optionally, if you want the bases to blend in more, like I mentioned before, you could just paint the rim of the base the same khaki or brown color that you painted the rest of the base with. And here's the finished product. Overall, these minions are really straightforward, since they're essentially one big shape with the option to add a couple of different colors to them. If I wanted to spend more time on these minis, there are probably a few things I'd go back and change, specifically regarding the red glow around the eyes and the little white dot in the middle, maybe toning that down a little bit more or trying to add some red hues into some of the crystal surfaces, but I'm pretty happy with how they look as a fairly quick and accessible paint job. If you have any questions about the process, or would like some advice or critique on how to paint your minions, I'm more than happy to help out with that. They were a great palette cleanser from painting some heroes, and if you ever feel like getting an easy painting win, I think these minions are the perfect choice. I've got a bit of a backlog of suggestions for heroes to paint next, but please feel free to suggest one you'd like to see me paint in the near future. And as always, thank you so much for your time and kind words, it really means a lot to me, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.